So I've just turned 25 years old, and that makes me one of the final members of a generation that sociologists refer to as Gen Y, or Generation Y. For most of you in the audience, you'll have heard of us probably called a different name. You'd have probably heard us called millennials. Now, for the uninitiated, millennials are a generational cohort that were born between roughly the early 1980s and the late 1990s. Every generation of the 20th and 21st century has got its own name, its own generational identifier, if you like. The generation before us were known as Gen X, the generation before them as the baby boomers, and there are other names for other generations as we go further and further back in time. Now, in recent years, I've noticed something quite interesting about our generation. Everyone seems to hate us. Now, you might think that that sounds like a bit of an exaggeration, but you only have to read the news or open the paper in the morning to see that millennials are getting a lot of bad press. In fact, some of this bad press is so bad that it genuinely borders on hysteria. Almost every day we see another article accusing millennials of killing one industry after another because the way that we behave and the way that we consume is different to that of our parents and grandparents. To prove this point to you, I decided to play a bit of a game over the past year. Every time I came across a headline accusing millennials of killing some industry or some sector, I decided to add it to a list. I'd like to share this list with you now. I think you'll agree it's pretty impressive. So since the start of this year, millennials have apparently killed off chain restaurants, cars, beer, wine, motorbikes, diamonds. We're killing both marriage and divorce. I'm guessing there's probably a link there. We're killing golf. We're killing canned tuna. We're killing hotels, cereal, fast food, and amazingly, we're even killing the anti-aging industry. They've even managed to have a go at young people for looking young. Now, taken together, all of these things have helped to create certain stereotypes about my generation. And a few years ago, I came face to face with that reality. I had just finished my undergraduate, and I'd started my first job at a financial services company. And I decided to leave that position after about 9 months. At the time, I thought that was fair enough. I wasn't really enjoying what I was doing, and I'd been offered a better job elsewhere. But that didn't stop my boss at the time calling me into his office and warning me that I was in danger of fulfilling this stereotype, this millennial stereotype of job hopping. I was accused of being a job hopper. Now, I'd never heard of this stereotype about my generation before, and I was genuinely a bit surprised that that's what my boss thought about people my age. So I decided I wanted to find out where he'd got this idea from, and it took me literally 2 minutes on Google to come across this headline. The prevailing narrative about members of Generation Y is that they're a fleet of job hoppers who think they're above the grunt work of an entry-level position. In other words, not the most desirable employees. That's from the Irish Independent in 2017. And I mean, these are damning words. And worse, it turns out my old boss was right. There is this stereotype about my generation being these sort of chronic job hoppers. Now, this actually gave me a bit of a complex, and I decided I wanted to know what else was being said about my generation. And after jumping online, I found out that there were some other pervasive stereotypes. So as well as being these sort of chronic job hoppers, I found out that we were being called lazy, complacent, entitled, self-obsessed, and somehow overconfident, but also too cautious and sensitive. The term snowflakes was used to refer to us quite a lot. Now, I think you'll probably agree with me that none of these qualities are, ones that you'd want to list on your CV or on your resume. And yet these stereotypes about my generation have become so pervasive that even when advertisers are trying to appeal to us, even when they're trying to sell to millennials, they can't help but use them. This year, the British Army ran a now infamous advertising campaign designed to try and promote recruitment numbers amongst people my age. And the result was this. Even the British Army doesn't seem to be able to get away from the stereotype that we're all these self-centered, narcissistic snowflakes. Now, I think seeing this advert was the final straw for me. I remember seeing it to and from work every single day on my commute, and it really got me thinking. I wanted to know what it was about my generation that made us so much worse than everyone that had ever lived before us. I began to wonder whether growing up in an age of social media had made us all really narcissistic, or was it the fact that we'd grown up with mobile phones in our hands? Had that made us so used to instant gratification that we couldn't stand to work our way up a career ladder? Or was it something else? Could it be that my generation are hated simply because we're young. It was about that time I came across this headline. A few 35-year-old friends are now just leaving their parents' nest. Many friends are getting married or having a baby for the first time, perhaps after a decade of hopscotching jobs in search of an identity. They're doing the kind of things our society used to expect from 25-year-olds. Now, on the surface, this looks like exactly more of the same, more of these stereotypes about chronic, job-hopping millennials. But then I noticed something weird. This wasn't a recent article. In fact, it's not even referring to millennials. It's from a 1984 Wall Street Journal article about Gen X. Now, that really was interesting. Gen X are the generation above us, and yet the same criticisms that were levelled at them were now being levelled at us by them. Now, I thought this was hilarious, and I wanted to see if we could go back further. So I tried to go to the generation above Gen X, and sure enough, I found this headline. Many young people are so pampered nowadays that they've forgotten there was such a thing as walking, and they make automatically for the buses. So similar kind of lazy, complacent stereotypes coming up here. And you can go back further. This is what the World War II generation had said about them when they were my age. We defy anyone who goes about with his eyes open to deny this as never before an attitude on the part of young folk, which is best described as grossly thoughtless, rude, and utterly selfish. These are the people that literally stopped Hitler, and yet they got called self-centered too when they were my age. Several hundred years before that, I absolutely love this one. One anonymous author in Town and Country magazine described the new generation of young men as a race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles that could never have descended in a direct line from the heroes of Poitiers and Agincourt. 1600 years before that, Seneca the Elder's complaining that their young men have grown slothful, their talents are left idle, and there is not a single honourable occupation for which they will toil night and day. This is the 1st century AD when Seneca's writing. These are the original millennials that he's referring to. And you can go back further, almost all the way back to the start of recorded history. The reason I wanted to share all this with you is because I think it's the best proof out there that people don't hate millennials because they're millennials. People hate young people. And they've done so for over 2,000 years. So where do all these modern negative stereotypes come from? Well, a lot of the problem seems to be largely with the generational research. A lot of this research that claims to have found these huge differences between the generations are more likely to have found something else. Let's start with job hopping, a cause close to my own heart. So there can be little doubt when you look at the existing research that young people are less satisfied, have less job satisfaction than older people. And it's completely right that they're therefore more likely to move jobs. But these studies have drawn the wrong conclusions. It's an age thing, not a generational thing. If you ask a 50-year-old on her 5th or 6th job, or a 21-year-old on her first job, chances are pretty high that the 50-year-old's going to say that they prefer their job more. They've had the chance to move around, to find out what they're good at and find out what they really want to do. It's an age effect, not a generational effect. And what about selfie culture? This idea that millennials are so much more narcissistic and self-centered than other generations. Well, the science doesn't stack up here either. If you look at the existing research, it's true that narcissism did spike slightly during the mid-2000s. That's about 1.8 points on a 40-point scale. But it's now back to where it was when records began in the 1980s. In general, millennials today are no more narcissistic than their parents and grandparents were when they were the same age. And if they are more narcissistic at this point in time compared to other generations, it's because young people tend to be more narcissistic, no matter when it was that they were young. It's an age effect, not a generational effect. The problem with drawing these lines between generations is it is a completely pointless exercise. There can be little doubt that the world is changing. And many of the challenges we face today as young people and older people are very different to challenges that humanity has ever had to face in the past. And so the way that we collectively deal with these challenges has to be different too. But it's these challenges that are different and millennial, not the people facing them. Thank you.